see this as well. Okay, my talk is about, yeah, as you can see in the title, about two documents, two manuscripts, both more or less from the same period, 1632 and around 1641. It's about Chinese. It is written by missionaries who are documenting, describing the Chinese language in this early period, and both documents, as you can see, are understudied. One of them has been published, the first one, Andres Palmeiro, and the second one is still unpublished, and I'm working on both texts, and always in the context of, you can study those documents in the context of descriptive linguistics, description of the linguistic varieties of that period, but I am mainly focusing on the history of linguistics. It is about the history of the establishment of the romanization of Mandarin Chinese, or Mandarin, or if you want, Chinese. Okay, the year is 1632. The first one, I call it Epistola. It is written by a Jesuit to his superiors in Rome. The main idea was that he had the order to investigate the linguistic situation in Eastern Asia. And the main question was, could we maybe use also Mandarin Chinese in the missions also outside China, in this case in Vietnam, for instance, or in Japan. So we had to compare those languages, and because in Europe they did not know exactly how different these languages were, and if it could have sense, make sense to study or just to teach one language for the missionaries for the whole East. His answer was, of course, negative, because he already concluded that those languages are so different. The second source is written by a Dominican, and the Dominicans came to China, mainland China, from Taiwan via Formosa, Taiwan. And in the same year, actually, the first Dominican arrived in what we call Fu'an, or Eastern Fujian, and then they already started to study Chinese. Here you have two reproductions of these two manuscripts. The first one on the left is Palmeiro's letter, and it has an appendix written in Latin. And then you can see a quadrilingual Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, and it has also word list. It is on the left side Latin, then we have Japanese, then you have the Chinese characters, then you have the Chinese romanization, and then the last one is the Anamitika lingua, the Vietnamese language. And this document is interesting because it is written exactly in a crucial period of the romanization of these Asian languages. On the right side, you see the, it is an anonymous work. It arrived in the Low Countries in the Netherlands in the 50s, so probably 9 years after it was written. It arrived in a collection at the Leiden University, then it went to Ireland, and now it is in the Oxford Library, but it is anonymous. It is a fragment appended to a dictionary, and this fragment has the name Arte de la Lengua Mandarina. Okay, just some context. Very briefly, I can say that the first printed grammar of Mandarin Chinese is actually from Martino Martini, and it is published in a collection by Melchizedek Thévenot, Relation des divers voyageurs. And you can see that it is already the end of the 17th century before we have the first printed grammar of Mandarin Chinese, as far as we know. And of course, there are some more sources, and those are written in Manila. And it is a different language. It is Southern Min, and there are also grammars published also from this period, and they are a little bit earlier. From the 1620s, 1630s, 1640, you have already descriptions of the language spoken by the Chinese minority in Manila. So here you find a very brief history of the romanization of Chinese. Of course, the first document was also relevant for Vietnamese and Japanese, but today I will focus on Chinese. A couple of names. You have Trigo and Ricci, and of course there are several periods, but actually you can say that 1626 is the most important period for the establishment of the romanization. It was quite successful by the Jesuit Nicolas Trigo, and this is the year actually when we really find an advanced and sophisticated system, and I shall go into the details. It was followed up by Francisco Varo, and this is an existing source, we know about him, and he's also mentioning previous sources, but they were considered to have been lost. And I tried to give a name to this anonymous manuscript, and I actually came to the conclusion that we have now a much older document than Francisco Varo's grammar of Chinese, probably written by Francisco Diaz, and you can see he died in 46, so it was much earlier than Francisco Varo. Okay, the first document is also about a little bit about theory about the linguistic situation in Asia. It contains information about the 3 languages, some grammatical comparisons, some observations about the relative pronoun, that this does not exist in those languages. So it's a kind of attempt to have a comparative approach, typological differences between 3 important Asian languages, and this is one part of this letter. It is also the Lord's Prayer, has word list, but also some theories and some comparisons in order to demonstrate that these languages are really different. So it will not make sense to teach Chinese outside China. That was the main purpose of this letter from Palmero to his superiors in Rome. Okay, to have an impression of the system, on the left side you see the Latin, then you have the Chinese character, and then you have modern pinyin, the transcription. Then in the middle you find the Palmero's romanization, and then you find also Ruggieri. One earlier, it was also called Ruggieri Ricci earlier system, and later in his works, Ricci also refined his romanization system. It's RLS, it's a Ricci late system, and then you have finally Trigo. That's the most important source for the document I'm studying. So the Palmero's letter is written before, actually. You can see there is a big discrepancy between the list of Palmero and on the right side the system in Trigo, as you can find it in the second document, Francisco Diaz. Okay, there are some principles. I will focus a little bit on the specific diacritics developed by the Jesuits, but also by the Dominicans, and quite simultaneously, but it is very difficult to say from which part, where does it exactly started, and who was influenced by whom. So there is one principle, not always consistent, one grapheme, one phoneme. There was a lot of misunderstandings because the priests came from Portugal, from Spain, so the CH is just an example, is muchacho, and you can find the word, the name of Johann Sebastian Bach, and you have, of course, for French, cheval, and so many different pronunciation of this digraph. So there was really a need to have a kind of uniform romanization system for all those priests who came from different nations. There are inconsistencies, and sometimes there are local varieties, but in general, we can see that it was surprisingly accurate and sophisticated, and I will go into some details. The Roman alphabet, the romanization system was more or less, the normal consonants we know from the Latin alphabet, and also the vowels. But the most important difference is that it's partially based on the Greek accents, and the missionaries are calling those diacritics tonadas. And it is quite confusing because it's not only referring to tones or tonemes, but it has different purposes, several purposes. They are more or less like the Greek accents used for tonemes, for tone differences. They can also represent aspiration, and you have the puntillos also representing vowel qualities. And in Manila, you even find diacritics for nasalization. On the left, you see also those combined diacritics. two consonants, and then you have a puntillo, you have the dot underneath, you have dots on the vowel, you have also the tonemes, and then also the aspiration sign, all coming together. And this may be inspired by Greek, because in Greek you have also combined diacritics with the spiritus asper lenis, you have of course the iota subscriptum, and maybe they have been inspired by how it was done for Greek, but there are differences. So the main important source we know about the romanization from the Spanish Dominicans, it's the printed grammar after his death. It's posthumously appeared in 1703. It's Arte de la Lengua Mandarina. And there we find a kind of description of those dots and actually what does it represent. It is a Nanking-based coin, and we have a very good study of, under others, from South Koblin about the reconstruction of Francisco Varro. So until today, this was known, and the earliest source was printed, as you could see, in 1703. But in this grammar, you can see another grammar is mentioned, el otro arte. He is also referring to el arte viejo, and until today, we could not find this grammar. And as I want to demonstrate, in those texts I have found, anonymous texts, but they are written in the 40s, probably attributed to Francisco Diaz. We can make some comparisons. This is a picture from Francisco Varro with the tonada simples, and we see the description. And we have here a kind of description from my anonymous text, and you find almost the same definition. I cannot go into the details, but here you have some combined diacritics with the spiritus asper and also combined with the tones. And here you find also in the anonymous text the combined diacritics with three. This means the tonada, the vowel quality with the puntillos, the little dots, and also the aspiration symbols. So here is just a fragment from this anonymous text talking about there are 5 modes of differences in pronunciation. And then we find a definition, also an articulatory definition, how you have to articulate it. And then the romanization is explained from this fragment. And if we compare them to Francisco Varro, it's quite similar. It's the same terminology, the same meta language, but there are also many important differences. So it was maybe not established yet, but it was already continuing with what Trigot has developed for Chinese in 1626, and it contains a lot of similar material. So you have again here a fragment with combined diacritics and a definition here from Francisco Diaz again. And the one interesting aspect is also that at the end we find also some pages devoted to Chincheo. This means this fragment contains information about Mandarin, but also Southern Min, Hokkien, the variety spoken by the minority in Manila. The manuscript was also written in Manila. So we have, this is not in Francisco Varro, it's only about Mandarin, but here we have a comparison between the two different traditions, actually, also talking about differences in numbers. The second is not the first, and there is some change. There's a kind of tradition here describing Mandarin tones and describing the tones of Southern Min or Hokkien, Manila Hokkien variety. Okay, in Manila.
2 more minutes.
Yes, I'm almost here. Here you have some differences. In Manila, you find more diacritics. It's a different language, of course, but we find also similarities and discrepancies. You do not find the numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7, but you do find 2, 4, and 6, and they have all a value and a meaning. But you find also the aspiration mark, and on the right hand, you find the N for the nasalization. And you find also 2 dots. So there are differences, but some symbols are also the same. In Manila, so you have tonemes, you have vowel qualities, you have aspirations for diacritics, nasal or nasalized vowels, but also the main importance is that they developed also a system for the nasal sounds, also combined diacritics, velonasal, and also with those numbers 2, 4, and 6. And this is not seen, as far as I know, in mainland China. for the description of Mandarin Chinese. So we do not have any printed sources. Maybe it caused the publishing houses a lot of problems to have a good edition. This happens also sometimes in Mexico. You find here and there something like this with an O with, we call this a little el modo de ojo, like an eye. The printing houses actually were trying to have the right types for publishing. For Chinese, it was a big problem. And Francisco Barro's text was actually printed in xylographic print in wooden blocks, not by movable types. But technically, they were able to make those grammars. Here you have a text from 1595 with the Baybayin alphabet or syllabary from the Philippines. So technically, they were able to do it, but we do not have printed. That is quite surprising because we have a lot of Vietnamese and also printed text in Japanese, but no grammar exists of Mandarin Chinese of this early period, except the xylographic print from Francisco Barro. It was a problem to have those characters, and actually this explains why we have only manuscripts. Technically, it took a long time, as in other parts of the world, and even 2 centuries later, for Otomi, a language from Mesoamerica. They had to go to Spain in order to have a very advanced alphabet for the description of Otomi. But in general, tonal languages were printed here and there, but it's quite exceptional. And actually, they do not mark always those diacritical signs. So the conclusion is Palmeiro, he wrote a text very important for the reconstruction of the romanization of Vietnamese and Japanese and Chinese. And actually, yeah, I can refer to an analysis of the whole, all those languages and interpretations, which is forthcoming. I did this in cooperation with my colleague sinologist Paulo de Troya. And the other one is actually the second one, the text attributed to Francisco Diaz. It's one of, as far as I know, the earliest text which actually makes use of the new, recently discovered or developed romanization system by Trigo. And it's antedating, it's earlier, almost 40 years older than the text we already know from Francisco Barro. And this is also a translation and an edition which will be published this year. And this is actually representing my recent research, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I am always ready to answer questions if I am able to do that. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, and it definitely was very interesting.